Good evening, everyone. My name is Pete Dworkin, and I am the chair of the Jail Planning Task Force. As most of you know, and there's a number of task force members here, we are a group of citizens who were appointed by the county executive and confirmed by the county council to look into the issues surrounding a new jail and the need for a new jail in Whatcom County. And most of you are here because you've heard about these issues. And we've consulted with Mr. Farbstein, who's here to my right, and I'd like you to introduce him to you. He's here this evening to make a presentation. I'm not going to go through his biography. He can tell you about himself if he wishes, but we'll make that information available online if anyone's interested in his resume. And so everyone understands what the intent here is that Mr. Farbstein has an immense experience in designing and building jails and working with communities on the issues that we're facing. And so we've asked him to impart some of his knowledge to us. He spent the day today and sometime yesterday speaking with stakeholders, county executive, law enforcement, court system folks, and community interests. And I think he has a couple other meetings tomorrow as well, or at least one other one. The point of that is for him to get a feel for our issues and what we have going on here. He's not here to conduct a specific analysis yet. We'll see. We may hire him or somebody like him in the future. But the reason I'm saying this is that he's here tonight mainly to present some of his ideas. He has a great presentation for us, and I'll leave it up to him as to when he wants to take questions. But hopefully everyone here will have an opportunity to get some of their questions answered. And we have 2 hours, and with that, I'll give it to Mr. Farbstein. Thank you for coming.
Thank you very much for having me, and thank you for coming out. I think it's just, to me, is the mic working? I can't really tell from here. Okay. As someone who works professionally in the field of jail planning, it's just fantastically heartening to see the level of interest and involvement and engagement that you have now in this community. So it's thrilling to me to be in a position where hopefully I can be of some assistance to you, give you some ideas that may be of some use as you go forward. I'm going to review a lot of information this evening, and there's going to be a presentation up here. The first part of the presentation, I'm going to talk about the process of jail planning, or what sort of the idealized version of that process might be. You'll see, those of you who've been engaged in the process will see that you've gone through some of those steps, that there are some steps that still need to be taken. Those of you who are not familiar with it, I'm not going to go into these things in great detail. I'm going to give the presentation to the folks at the county. It seems that they're in the habit of putting everything on the website, so it'll be there. But I'd also like to invite you to interrupt me as I go along if you would like to know more about some of the issues that I'm talking about. He says I shouldn't do it. I was warned a little bit. I'm actually not asking for a debate about these things, but if you want to know more from me, if it turns into a debate, I'll cut it off and we'll go on with the presentation, frankly. But I'm going to talk about the process. I'm going to talk about some of the concepts that inform jail design, and then I'm going to show you quite a lot of examples of contemporary jails and a couple of prisons that embody some of these concepts in various ways. And I've purposely put in a couple of examples that you might find a bit provocative. They may represent directions that go further than you might want to go in this community, but I thought it might be stimulating for you to see them and think about them. So then at the end, if there are still more questions and answers, we'll be happy to discuss them. By the way, I've been here for about a day and a half. I've had a chance to be introduced to and talk to a substantial number of people, but not yet that many. I'm curious. I haven't met all the members of the Jail Planning Task Force. If you're on the Jail Planning Task Force, would you raise your hand. Okay, well, we're going to spend some, oh yeah, there you are. We're going to spend some time together also tomorrow morning where we'll have a chance to discuss things further. But if you're a member of the public, would you raise your hand? Yeah, that's great. Well, thank you. Thank you very, very much for coming. I really do appreciate it. So let me start by talking about the kind of idealized version of the jail planning process. The two questions I'd like to address are, well, what happens when? What's the kind of sequence of steps that we go through? And who should be involved? And there's an organization chart up there, moderately legible. Not going to go through who all the players are, but the notion here is that there are a lot of different participants who reasonably need to be involved. This is a major public project. It represents a major expenditure of public funds. It has a major impact on the community. And there is every reason, as you have now, to have the public engaged in the process. So a community, whoops, okay, see, I now have to learn how. A community advisory committee makes a lot of sense, advising and giving suggestions to your county government. In terms of the activities, and I'm going to talk a little bit about each of these phases and what happens in each, and you'll see kind of time ranges, and even on the graphics you'll see a little bit different time range than is on the text. But the main activities begin with what we call a needs assessment, kind of self-explanatory. It's an assessment of needs. What do we need in this jail? And I'm going to go through this in depth, so I'm not going to say what it is now, but certainly one of the principal questions that needs to be answered, and it's, I guess, an area of some controversy here, is how big should the jail be? How many beds does it need to provide? And that's one of the key questions that would be answered in that phase. Once you have an idea of the scale of the project, I've indicated a phase called a feasibility study. It's kind of an intermediate phase where you can begin to look at some options of how you could meet the need for those beds. Should we build a new facility? Can we remodel an old facility, add on to it? And I'm speaking very generally. I'm not speaking about your county. But it also addresses the question of how we're going to pay for the facility. So before you go way down the road, figuring out roughly what it's going to cost, not only to build but to operate, how you're going to pay for it, is a very important step. Then there's something we call programming, which in this case is facility or architectural programming. It looks in great detail at what's going to happen in the facility and what the project needs to consist of. Site selection is very important, and notice I didn't put a time down because it's hard to know sometimes how long it's going to take to select a site. We'll talk about that in a bit. And then, oops. I'm sorry. Bear with me while I get these controls down. I'm very sorry. Then you build the building, and then you move into it, and you have a jail. So I'm going to talk now in some depth about the needs assessment. Again, the overall goal is to define what an effective and efficient, cost-efficient jail is within a county justice system that is working effectively. What does that mean? That means protecting public safety. It means addressing issues of crime and how crime is dealt with in the community. It means having enough jail beds so that the system can function. So what do we need and when do we need it? How many beds do we need today? How many beds do we need in 10 or 15 years? Should we build them now? Should we add on later? These kinds of questions. Keep wanting to point. As I think those of you who have begun to be involved in jail planning have come to learn, the jail is an expensive building to build. Each bed that you build costs quite a lot of money. I'm not going to throw a figure out. Quite a lot of money to build. And then it costs quite a lot of money over its entire lifetime to operate. The principal component of those operating costs is staff. There's kind of a little formula that people in this business talk about. If the cost of building the jail is 20%, then the cost of running it over 20 or 30 years is going to be 80% of that total. So the operating cost has a huge bearing on the overall long-term costs of the jail, and so every decision that's made that has to be made from the point of view of making the jail efficient to operate. So we've asked the question, how many beds? We've justified each bed. What type of beds do we need? Beds range, jail beds, jail cells range from very high security beds that are very expensive to build to rather low security beds. I'll show you some examples of each, but a lower security might be an open dormitory that isn't all that expensive to build and doesn't have a lot of hardware. It's just quite the opposite, really, of the maximum security kind of bed. As we look at the number of beds we need and the kinds, we need to look at the way the jail functions within the criminal justice system. Law enforcement agencies arrest individuals who are accused of crimes, and many of those they bring in to be booked at the jail. The jail doesn't go out looking for customers. The customers are brought to them. So they don't have in themselves a lot of control over how many show up, unless you get to a situation like you had some years ago where you don't have the capacity and had to limit the amount of bookings that the jail could receive. But in general, the jail doesn't really control who shows up at the door. The jail receives them. But then how long an individual spends in the jail, again, is going to depend on the functioning of the justice system. It's going to depend on charges that are filed by the prosecuting attorney. It's going to depend on how long the court proceedings take to resolve the case. And, of course, it's going to depend on the outcome. If the individual is found guilty and part of the sentence involves jail time, then the jail is going to hang on to them for a while. So when we look at the number of beds, we have to examine precisely how people who arrive at the jail leave the jail. How are they released? Are they going to spend all of the time that they wait for their court proceedings in the jail, or will some of them be released to the community? Will they be released on bail, or will the judge decide that they're trustworthy enough that they can be released on what's called their own recognizance? So for every local justice system handles these things within the purview of the law in somewhat different ways. So a jail planner will look in great detail at how these processes work and talk to the players in the system about whether there are fine-tuning adjustments, whether there are programs and alternatives which can be implemented which would affect the jail population one way or the other. The general interest is trying to limit the population to no more than it absolutely needs to be, but some of them may result in increasing the jail population. So finally, we look at a set of projections. The actual statistical formula for doing projections is, in a way, not very complicated. I talked about how many people arrive at the jail. Really, if you look then at how long each of them spends on average, that gives you an idea of what the average daily population of the jail might be. And so the formula isn't complicated, but what gets interesting are the kind of policy decisions that are made about these alternatives to incarceration that could modify those general projections one direction or the other.